Hello, welcome to this video on Thomas Egenes, Introduction to Sanskrit, Lesson 9. In this lesson we'll be looking at the grammar and vocabulary, starting at page 108. The grammar of this lesson concentrates on the sandhi, that is the conjunction where one word meets another word, where the first word ends in the visarga. Let me get out of this. The visarga, which is the one, of course, that we write as the subdotted H, and on its own is pronounced as a kind of rough sound with an echo vowel at the end. So namah, often pronounced as namaha. And the rules there, on the face of it, look fairly complex. There's this chart on page 108. There's another chart on page 111, which it presents the same material in a different way. If you understand certain underlying patterns, it's actually not that bad after all, as I hope to demonstrate to you as we go along now. Look first at this chart on page 108. Final letters of the first word, that's along the top. There's any vowel followed by a r, any vowel followed by visarga. We'll use the Sanskrit term for it. Visarga, that's the one we write as the subdotted H. Visarga actually just means like emitting, letting go. It's like an expulsion or an emission of breath. It's called the visarga, the expulsion of breath. And so we've got any vowel followed by a r, any vowel followed by a visarga, except and ah. And then we've got special rules for and ah. So look at the first column. So the first column, I'll hold it up there. That's the one going down here. And we've got the second column is the and the third column is the And there are numerous entries in this chart, but as you will see, they fall into a pattern. So what I'm inviting you to do in particular is just to spot the patterns. If you spot the patterns, it will all become easy. Now, what I'm going to do is to start with the third column first. That's the column that ends in Let me call up my iPad for you. Here we are. So we are going to look at the visarga of words ending in largely because they're very common and we've already done quite a bit, and because most of you already know some of the rules, and some of you, even though you may not have studied the rules, actually may know them without knowing. For example, we have the word namah from the root nam. The original meaning of the root nam means to bend, and by extension means to bend the body, therefore to bow, and by further extension to pay homage to. So it's a class 1 verb. So the third person singular is namati. And I bow, I reverence. Now let me, is namami. Buddhang namami. And I say you know some of the rules already, because, for example, when a word that in very, very ancient times, pre-Vedic times, ended in an S, that was how it was pronounced. This is namah would have been originally namas, buddha would have been buddhas, as has been retained, for example, in Latin and Greek. Classical Latin, of course, and in both ancient and modern Greek, where you get the nominative ending in an os, and in and in Latin the nominative ending in us, with the S still pronounced. As time went on, already by the time that the Vedas were composed, if a word ended in an S, the S wasn't pronounced in full, it was lenited or softened to an H or an ah sound. Not namas, but namah. By the way, when I say lenited, it means it's a linguistic word for softening. It's from the Latin word lenis, meaning soft. So the lenition of a sound means the softening of a sound. We see it frequently, for example, in Irish, the Irish pronunciation of English. In English, when I say Saturday, we're pronouncing the T in full. In Ireland, you tend to hear a pronunciation like Saturday, where the T is lenited. So the verb is to lenite, in other words, softened. So I will be using this verb occasionally, lenition and lenite, to refer to that phenomenon. So the final S is lenited to an ah. If it occurs at the end of a word, or the end of a line of poetry, or if it occurs at the end of a sentence, or at the end of a line of poetry, or if it's pronounced in isolation. Looking again at the ending in ah, because special rules apply. In other words, the visarga preceded by a short ah. Look at column 3, the first series. I'm going to point it out to you here. See this one here. So if I put my finger on the right place, yeah, down a whole series of. So if the rule is, look at the initial letter of the second word. If it's a g, j, d, b, b, the nasal, the y, v, r, l, or h, all of these are the voiced consonants. As the voiced and unvoiced, the difference between b and b and the and th, that's voiced and unvoiced. Where you get ah followed by a word beginning in a voiced consonant, it simply changes to o. That is why you have namah. Sometimes the word is repeated. You want to say it twice, and you would say without sandhi namah, namaha. But what does it become? It becomes namo namaha, namo namaha. So the ah becomes an o. Sorry, what am I looking at? Namo namaha. Why does the ah become o? Because it's followed by a voiced consonant. And we also, for example, say Namo Buddhaya. You'll see just under the ah, I'll point out here, there's this little footnote in reference to a footnote 2, and that is to indicate that, sorry, I've skipped down a line, the voice consonants. If I go back to the top line, sorry, there's this line across here, I've got my pen there. If it's followed by a vowel. Okay, just to know, if it's a voice consonant, the ah becomes o, and that's clear enough. If it's followed by a vowel, then the ah simply loses the visarga, unless that vowel is of itself is a short ah, which comes o, namostu. Let me go over. So I'll write it without sandhi first. To remind you, when I put an asterisk in front of a word, it means that it's being written deliberately wrong by way of illustration. So namah astu, astu, may it is the third person imperative, may it be, let it be. Namah astu becomes namostu. And we tend to write an apostrophe in Roman script to indicate the loss of that ah. So namastu becomes namustu. If, however, the following vowel is anything other than a short a, then all that happens is that the visarga drops off. So if you want to write, for example, nama iti, that just becomes nama iti. And the remaining vowel remains in place. And written in Devanagari, they would be written as separate words, and just as we write them, and even pronounce them as separate words using the Roman script. We've just dealt now with it all becoming an O, Namo Buddhaya, Namo Namaha, Namo Yushmabhya, Namaste, by the way, singular, Namo Yushmabhya in the plural. What happens then when the visarga, is followed by a consonant, by an unvoiced consonant? Well, happily, the rule for what happens is the same, whether it's aha, or any other vowel. So looking at the and again this applies to them all. If the following consonant is a k or k or p or p, or another of the sibilants, a sh or a sh or a s, any of those, or if it's the end of line, all of those, the final visarga, sorry, visarga is always a final, the visarga remains. Sorry, I think I might have attempted unsuccessfully to pause. There may have been a hiatus there, sorry. Some examples are given on the next page that I'll go through when we get to the next page. So before k, k, p, p, and the sibilants at the end of a line, or in isolation, or at the end of a sentence, is Egenes writes end of line. Also for end of line, read or in isolation or end of sentence. The remains unchanged as the visarga. Look, however, at what happens if the next word begins in a ch, aspirated or unaspirated, or a t, aspirated or unaspirated, or a d, unaspirated or aspirated. What happens then is that the visarga takes on the quality as pronounced at the same place that the next word starts. That's why, for example, this is a rule you all already know. So you have, and to write it deliberately and correctly, we have the well-known greeting, but we all know that that's pronounced namaste, often written as one word, but in fact it's two words, homage, namaste to thee. And the visarga there becomes an S because it flips to the same point of articulation. In other words, the tongue is at the same place, so the visarga flips to the same place that the tongue is going to be for the t to be pronounced. So namaste, not mahte, but namaste. And exactly the same applies if it's a ch. So if it's and homage. So ch, meaning and. What happens? Becomes namashcha. Namashcha. All that's happening is that for ease of pronunciation, for phonetic ease, namashcha becomes namashcha. And exactly the same applies where the following word begins in a retroflex da, whether unaspirate or aspirate. It makes no difference for these purposes whether the following consonant is aspirated or not. This is a fairly rare phenomenon, actually, because there are not many words in Sanskrit, not many at all, that actually start with a da. It seems to have been originally more of a Dravidian consonant, because the da is very frequently found within a word in Sanskrit, even more frequently in Pali. But very, very rare to find it at the beginning of a word. And you will often find, actually, it's non-Indo-European words, most likely and most frequently of Dravidian and original local Indian origin, before the arrival of Indo-Iranian, the arrival of the Indo-European language. And it often refers to things with which the incoming migrants were unfamiliar, particularly things like flora and fauna and particular items used that were unfamiliar to them. So what did they do? Rather than using their original, the immigrants, I mean, the migrants, the Indo-European speaking migrants, they simply adopted the local words for them, and many of these local words did begin with da, which is why we see a number of things, flora, fauna, items and tools and whatnot, that begin with da in Sanskrit that do not, or by their shape and form, you can see that they don't belong to the Indo-European languages. Anyway, that little digression just shows to the if they do get a word beginning with a da and the visarga, previous word ends in a ha, then that becomes simply a sh, a shta. I can't think of any examples offhand. We'll think of some as we go along. The rule that I've just explained, and you see in the bottom half of page 108, about what happens to the visarga when the next word begins with a consonant. As I mentioned, that is the identical rule applies whatever be the preceding vowel. So it applies to words ending in ah, or I, and so on. Oh, au, I, they all follow that same rule for when the following word begins in a consonant. The rule now, where a word ends in visarga preceded by a long ah, that's ah, very often found, of course, in our plurals. Buddha, singular, buddha, plural. Now you can see from the table here, if you look at this middle column, the ah, next word begins with a vowel. Whatever the vowel is, the ah simply becomes ah. You drop off the visarga. Couldn't be simpler. The rule for where the first word ends in a visarga with another vowel, let's take two examples here. Let us take muni, meaning a sage, muni, and let's take the word for guru, guru. So the stem forms are just muni and guru. Nominative singular, munih, munihi, munihi, and that shadow vowel reflects the vowel before the visarga. So in pause, in isolation, end of a sentence, it would tend to be pronounced munihi, munihi, and guruhu, guruhu. What happens then if the following word begins in a vowel or sorry, I've lost myself. If the following word begins in a vowel or a voiced consonant, the visarga changes to r. So the sage goes. It becomes, oops, sorry. So gachati goes. It would be munir gachati. Munir gachati. Not munir gachati, munir gachati. And the guru speaks vadati with a v. It would be gurur vadati. Gurur vadati. Vadati. When we're writing these words in transliteration in Roman script, then we would separate them as two separate words. And of course, they would be perceived as two separate words. They are two separate words. The muni goes, munir gachati. The ih becoming ir is a purely phonetic thing. But bear in mind that in writing Devanagari, because a r can be joined to a g, then you join them up. So I'm just writing now, I write munir gachati in Devanagari. So I'll write it slowly and clearly for you. Mu. The E will come. That hook for the R. So munir gachati. So this, see this hook there. This is a g on its own, and that hook is rga. So this is rga. Yeah. So munir gachati, and this can cause you, if you are not alert to it, this can cause you a bit of a problem to start with if you're reading in Devanagari. But you will get used to it, and of course, the more you learn these rules, the more you'll know and expect what's coming. To the rule about the ih and becoming ir and ur, there is one exception, and that is if the following word begins with a r, because there is a rule, an inviolable rule in Sanskrit and Pali, that you can never double the r. So what happens, say for example, from the root raksh, to protect, rakshati, he, she, or it protects. So you've got, it wants to be, say the guru protects. It wants to be an asterisk because you can't have guru rakshati. But this would create a double r. You are not allowed to have that. What you do instead is you drop the r and lengthen the preceding vowel. As it were, it's called a compensatory lengthening. You've lengthened the vowel to compensate for the loss of the r. That's why it becomes guru rakshati. And similarly, the sage protects would be muni rakshati. Because you can't have munir rakshati, you'd have a double R then, so it becomes muni rakshati. So we'll look now at the, sorry, I'll stop myself there. So hopefully you'll see that if you see the kind of logic behind it and see the patterns there, rather than learn everyone individually, take a higher up view, spot the patterns, spot what's going on, and then the individual instances will all fall into place much more easily. So we'll look now at the examples on lesson, on page 109. Paragraph 2, I've just been through that effectively and going through this table. So on page 109, paragraph 3, looking at the examples. Some of them you've already done from previous lessons. So without Sandhi, Rama, I'll just take off my screen for the moment. Ramah gacchati becomes Ramu gacchati, and the heroes go. Without sandhi it would be Virah gachanti, but what happens? G, voiced consonant, so the visarga drops. Virah gachanti. We now see the same words, but the next one, the second word, begins with a p. So Ramah pashyati. What happens? The visarga remains unchanged. Ramah pashyati. Same with the ah. Virah pashyanti. There's no separate visarga, no separate sandhi to be applied. Number 4, it says final S should be treated as a subdotted H visarga. For example, Ramas follows the same rules as Rama. Either would become Ramo before Gacchati. Let me just explain in a bit more detail what that means. One of the most common ways in which you get a final visarga, let's take the ah. One of the most common ways you find it is declensional, or in verbs. In other words, it's part of a grammatical ending. So we have, for example, Buddha, stem form Buddha. That's before you've given it a case, nominative, accusative, and so on. But in the masculine form, masculine singular, Buddha. And when that happens, then it changes, for example, to O, according to the rules we've just seen. What is meant by this rule 4? I think what Egenes means, but I'll say it anyway, because that's what I mean. Where you get the ah, with a word ending in an S, because that's part of the stem. Let's take the word namas. That's part of the namas is the stem of that word. It's a what we know as a consonantal declension. The stem ends in a consonant. Manas is another one. Where you get the word ending in a final S, it behaves exactly the same way as any other word ending in ah or as. That's where you get Namo Buddhaya. And a suffix, for example, maya, not connect with maya. Maya meaning simply consisting of. In the first line of the Dhammapada, Mano Pabangama, Mano Sekta, Mano Maya Dhamma. Maya means consisting of. So in Sanskrit, and this bit applies to Pali as well, Manas Maya, meaning consisting of mind, made of mind, become Manomaya. Manomaya. Right, we now look at paragraph 5. So after these sandhi rules have been applied, sorry, I forgot to I forgot to share my screen again. Here we are. I was writing Buddha. The Buddha, I wrote first Buddha, stem form, and then nominative singular Buddha, become Buddho. That's all with namas manas, the suffix maya consisting of, therefore you don't say manas maya but manomaya. So looking at number 5, after these sandhi rules have been applied, if the first word ends in a vowel, remember, if after the sandhi rules have been applied, if the first word ends in a vowel, he said including visarga, but I think he meant to say including the dropping of visarga, then there is a break between the words. For example, let's look at the heroes come. The heroes, plural, agachanti, they come. Now, there's the general rule of sandhi that if the preceding word ends in an a, long or short, and the following word begins in an a, long, I think long or short. When I wrote the short sign and the long sign means the same rule applies to either. What happens then? By sandhi, they merge into a long a. That's the normal rule. But that's only if the first word, without applying any sandhi to it at all, just ends in an a or an a with nothing following. For example, the girl, kanya. The girl is coming, kanya agachati. I get an a followed by another a, so they merge into a single a. So it's a kanya gachati. Where, however, it's very important to remember this, where, however, the final a is the result of a sandhi. In other words, you've got an ah, virah agachanti. Okay, ah followed by vowel means you drop the visarga. So you've got vira agachanti. Now you've got a word, and this now ends in an a, the vira ends in an a, agachanti begins in an a. Do they merge? No, they do not, because you only ever apply sandhi once. You apply sandhi once, vira with visarga agachanti, apply sandhi, drop the visarga, vira agachanti, leave it as it is. Don't apply sandhi twice. So you do get this, it's called a secondary hiatus. A primary hiatus would be like the girl is coming, kanya agachati. You aren't allowed that hiatus, a followed by a melds into, by sandhi becomes long a, kanya agachati. So you don't have that primary hiatus. But the secondary hiatus resulting from the application of visarga, virah agachanti, that is allowed. In fact, it's mandatory to leave that as it is. Right, turning now to some more examples on page 110. So looking at these examples, Ramah chintayati, Rama is thinking. Remember the ah followed by ch is pronounced at the same point of articulation, so the vocal organs go to the same spot that the ch comes out as, so it becomes Ramash chintayati, not Ramah, but Ramash chintayati. Rama is standing, without sandhi, Ramas tishtati, with sandhi. So did I say Ramas tishtati? Without sandhi, Ramah tishtati, with sandhi, Ramas tishtati. And here the second two examples are examples of vowel sandhi. Gachati iti becomes gachatiti, and bhava Arjuna, be O Arjuna, becomes bhavarjuna. The point that Egenes is making here is that where the sandhi results in a long vowel, like gachati iti, gachatiti, then by convention we write that it becomes a single long vowel in the Devanagari script, and we've got no option in transliteration but to repeat that phenomenon. That's why we write gachatiti. And bhava Arjuna, bhavarjuna, we write them as one word, because phonetically they become as one word. Those two vowels have merged to become one vowel. I would mention here about the use of the circumflex. Let's just look at the gachati iti becomes gachatiti. And so written in so written in Devanagari. Sorry, silly me. Gachatiti. Gachatiti. You see? T, T. In transliteration, but Devanagari can't do this, you will find some scholars, Moni Williams does it in his Sanskrit dictionary, a number of other transliterations do it. I sometimes do it in my edited text. I write it as a circumflex like that to show that it is this long E is not originally a long E. It become a single long E by the merging of two vowels. But you'll find this phenomenon of the circumflex used only in transliteration because the Devanagari script will simply write it as a long vowel like any other long vowel. There's no special marker in the Devanagari script to show that it's by the blending of two vowels. In fact, Moni Williams goes one step further. The way he, for example, if it's a long A followed by an A, he's going to write it with a circumflex, but a circumflex, a special typeface there with heavy, you see, the first part of the circumflex will be written in bold, thick line. The second part of the circumflex will be written in a thin line. That's to reflect that it's a long vowel followed by a short vowel. And for example, if it was an I plus E becomes E in the Moni Williams dictionary, the second arm of that circumflex would be written thicker, just as an aid to the student to show this a merging of E and E. Let us now okay, number 6, just I'm talking about paragraph 6 on page 110, effectively repeats in a different way what we've already done. Looking now at page 111. Yeah, I'll go through this bit quite quickly because it effectively repeats in a different way what has already been said. Essentially, that when applying Sandhi, one of the things you've got to look at is particularly Sandhi with the Visarga. Sandhi with Visarga, by the way, is the most complex of all the types of Sandhi. The rest are a lot simpler than that, I think. But you might say it's also the most important form of Sandhi. You're going to see it, almost, I would say, at least once and several times on every single line of Sanskrit that you read. So what he's done there, he's explaining this, the Sandhi with Visarga, the second word begins with a letter, and those letters can be divided, broadly speaking, into 3 groups: the vowels, unvoiced consonants, and voiced consonants, and we've actually just dealt with that. So he's simply repeated all of the vowels, all of the unvoiced consonants, and all of the voiced consonants in this chart at the middle of page 111, and repeated the rule that if the second word begins with a vowel, just becomes except, and he repeats the rule where followed by second word beginning that becomes o, then namah astu, namostu, and so on. And long visarga followed by a vowel always just becomes easy to remember. And if the vowel preceding the visarga is something other than an or an any other vowel, then it becomes ra. So the guru is guru asti, and guru rasti. The muni said is avadat. So not muni avadat, muni ravadat. And rule B, now I'm looking near the bottom of page 111. First letter of the second word is a voiced consonant, just becomes o, and ah becomes ah. Any other vowel followed by a h, that becomes a r, and that is before a word, except for a word beginning with a r, where you have a compensatory lengthening. As we're saying, the bhikkhu protects, bhikkhu rakshati becomes bhikkhu rakshati, but it's still that same word, bhikkhu, singular, nominative singular. We now move on from the visarga. And by the way, if you're having a problem learning all this by heart, don't worry. Maybe you could say the 80-20 rule applies, that 80% of all of these applications apply in just sorry, I've got the 80-20 rule all wrong. 20% of these rules will be applying in 80% of the applications. So in other words, you're going to see it repeated. The most common ones you'll see repeated again and again and again, and they'll very soon go into you, and it'll become automatic to remember them as you go along. The most important thing is not to remember actively, but at least to recognize what's happening when you see it. So switch back to camera only and hope that next time round I will remember to switch on my iPad screen. We've studied the parasmaipada endings, the transitive, the often translated as active. The category is not exactly the same as transitive and intransitive, nor is it exactly the same category as active and passive. We've got the let's just use the Sanskrit terms for them. We have the parasmaipada, endings of the verb. Bhavati, he is, rakshati, protects, vadati, says, gachati, goes. There are a number of verbs that are atmanepada, parasmai pada, pada meaning a word, dhammapada, the words of the doctrine. Parasmai means for another, parasmai pada, the word for another. Atmane pada, atmane is the dative of atman, self, atmane pada, a word for oneself. In other words, the form of the verb, broadly speaking, but not exactly like a transitive or a reflexive verb, doing something for yourself. Greek still has that voice. You have active, middle, and passive. Active and passive, does is done, says is said. But there is this middle form of the verb which Greek has and Sanskrit has. Pali has almost entirely lost. There are remnants of it here and there, but Sanskrit retains it in full. And it has different endings. Let me just give you an example of the difference between active, middle, and passive. By the way, there's a separate passive in Sanskrit, which is much simpler to recognize. Here we're dealing with what we call active and middle, or atmanepada, sorry, active, parasmaipada, and atmanepada. Let's just say the mother dresses the child. Pure active verb. Subject, verb, object. The mother dresses the child. This would be a straight parasmaipada verb in Sanskrit. A does B. Put it into the passive now. The child is being dressed, or the child is dressed by the mother. Straight passive. X is done by Y. What about the verb getting dressed? I am getting dressed. It's an action that you're doing, but an action directed towards yourself. Same with washing, for example. The mother washes the baby. the baby is being washed, pure passive, by the mother, or I'm having a wash. You see, you're washing, but you're doing it to yourself, either to yourself or something you're doing for your own benefit. That in Greek is what's called the middle form. It's neither purely active nor purely passive. The middle, something you're doing, but to or for yourself. And that's the same as the atmanepada, the word for oneself. Atmane, for oneself, pada, word. So that is what we mean here by, Egenes uses the term middle, and the middle endings that actually does reflect the word that the grammarians use for Greek. Now, in Vedic and pre-Vedic times, there was a fairly sharp distinction. And washing somebody else and washing yourself. The one would be the parasmaipada endings, and for yourself would be the atmanepada endings. That distinction tended to get a little bit blurred in the later language. So sometimes one verb might be parasmaipada when you kind of expect it to be atmanepada, or it could be atmanepada when you could expect it to be parasmaipada on that rule that I've just stated, or the old-fashioned division, doing something to somebody else, doing something to yourself. Many verbs can equally conjugate in both, just without any distinction of meaning. And some verbs, for example, will retain that meaning. For example, if a Brahmin is performing a sacrifice, I'm talking about the old Vedic usage, if he's performing a sacrifice on behalf of, say, a family, say there's a wedding, for example, or some family event, and the Brahmin has been invited to go and perform a certain sacrifice to bring blessings on that wedding. It's yajati in the parasmaipada, because he's performing it for somebody else. But if he's doing a sacrifice like as part of his own practice, not involving anyone else, nobody's asked him to do it, then it's yajate, he's doing it for himself. So occasionally we are going to see that distinction maintained. So looking at these, let's just read what Egenes says here. We'll learn the middle endings, atmanepada. For the middle voice, the fruit of the action is said to go to the agent, fruit, that is the result of the action. Yeah, that's said in Greek, and as we understand it. For the active voice, the fruit of the action goes to somebody else. That's para. Para, another, dative, parasmai. Many verbs usually take active endings, many usually take middle endings, and some take both endings, right? So this is the form of the middle verb, bhash, to speak. And this is the class 1 verb. So we have, I'm looking at halfway down page 112, bhashate, bhashase, bhashe. Just compare those. It'll help you to remember it. If you remember it in conjunction with the ordinary parasmaipada ending. So let's look at bhashate. Let's compare it with, say, the parasmaipada bhavati. What's the difference? The only difference there is the E becomes an A. Bhashase. What's bhavasi? Okay, so the only difference there is the E, C, and Se. Bhashate as opposed to bhavati. Bhashase as opposed to bhavasi. The first person, I speak, in the parasmaipada it would end in ami, gachami, bhavami, but it's just an a. So I speak is bhashe, parasmaipada, compared with bhavami. Looking at the dual, so they too speak. Bhashete, whereas in the Parasmaipada, it is bhavata, bhavataha. So the attaha becomes ete. And you have exactly the same change. You too speak is bhashete. And what is you two are? Bhavata. Note that in the second and third person dual, the difference in all cases is simply the unaspirated ta. Bhavataha. They two are. Bhashete. They two speak. Bhavataha with an aspirated ta for the second person. You two. Bhavata. You two are. Bhashete. You two speak. And we two are speaking is avahe. Vashavahe. And what is we two are? It is bhavavaha. Bhavavaha. Now, in the plural, we two are is bhavavaha with a v, and we plural are is bhavamaha. The only difference being the v becomes a m. Bhavamaha. It's the same, mercifully, the same difference for the Atmanepada, because we two speak, we plural speak is bhashamahe. The we two speak bhashavahe. We plural speak is bhashamahe. Bhashamahe. You plural are is bhavata. Put the plural here, bhavanti. You, this is the parasman bhavata. There is a an entirely different ending for the second person plural atmanepada. It is adve. So you plural are speaking is bhashadve. Bhashadve. And the rule for the third person plural, mercifully simple, because the e changes to an a. So bhashante, they speak. Bhashante. And reference is made here to page 316, where there is a separate listing in the section of tables on these endings. It actually might be worth your while having a look at page 316, which sets out in tabular form these different endings for the active and middle. Or as I would prefer to use, the Parasmaipada and Atmanepada endings. And then he does it for the imperfect, and then going to do it for the others. Imperative, oh no, not there. Anyway, look at, for the time being enough for you to look at page 316 as a summary chart. And then in paragraph 3 on page 112, again, it more or less repeats what I've just been saying. Although most of the verbs we've learned are usually seen with active endings, most of the verb before bhash, they occasionally take middle endings. For example, okay, he's saying that we've learned some verbs with a parasmapada ending, but there is the verb chint, which can take both active and middle endings. We have parasmaipada, word for another, atmanepada, a word for oneself or verbal form for oneself. Ubhaya means both. Ubhayapada means both. In other words, you can conjugate it either as a parasmaipada or as an atmanepada, very often with no distinction of meaning at all. Sometimes, as I mentioned in the case of the sacrificing, with a distinction of meaning, whether you are, which reflects the ancient, even Vedic and pre-Vedic way of doing it, the ancient rule about the parasmaipada directed for to or for another, and the atmanepada directed to or for yourself. Now, last bit of grammar at the bottom of page 112. There is no verb for to have in Sanskrit. So the one way of forming it, something is of me. Mama asti, literally it is of me, just means I have it. And the example here is given of the hero, which in English we say the hero has a son. In Sanskrit we say of the hero a son is. Virasya putro bhavati. Also putro asti becoming putrosti. Putrah asti, putrosti. Looking now to the vocabulary on page 113. The first word, eva, only, ever. Okay, there's a lot more to it than that. Eva will emphasize, it often contrasts. For example, look at the logo of the Republic of India that I've mentioned to you before in these classes. Satyam eva jayate. The Satyam eva jayate. Look at this, an atmanepada verb from G to conquer, jayate, atmanepada, not jayate but jayate. Satyam eva jayate, satyam the truth, satyam jayate, the truth conquers. Okay. Satyam eva jayate, the force of the eva here, it is singling out truth among the possible other contenders as to who will be victorious. Lies, violence, hatred, warfare, which will ultimately conquer. No, true. Satyameva jayate. It means like, it is the truth among all other things. It is the truth that will conquer. So the way to translate eva will depend on context, but that is normally what it's getting at. It's singling it out, meaning only that, or that above other things, or only that among other things. Griham, a house, clear enough. We have the word for the householder, the grihastha, literally the house stander, one who stays in a house. Jalam, water. We've got the word, this is jalam, neuter. Jala, just right, neuter. We have the word paniyam, panya, neuter, so paniyam in the nominative. That is specifically from the root pa, to drink. And so paniya specifically refers to drinkable water or potable water. That pot comes from the same root, that's root pa, to drink. And I mean, in modern Hindi, for example, the word pani is all kinds of water. but in Sanskrit it's specifically for water that you can drink, whereas jala or udaka also is another udaka. Jala and udaka just means water generally, irrespective of whether you can drink it or not. Here's our verb, ji, active, jayati. Here is a wonderful example. Look at this number 4, vocabulary item ji, and it tells you it's an active, jayati. But the logo of the Republic of India, jayate, this is one of those words that can conjugate in both ways, jayati or jayate, as up here. Is there a difference in meaning? Possibly slightly. If you were saying that he specifically conquered the enemy, and you were stating as in a verb, he conquered the enemy, then it would tend to be jayati. But just conquers generally, is victorious generally, achieves victory, then it can do slight emphasis of tone there. You're not talking about conquering somebody else, just about being victorious. Jayate. It kind of, in a sense, softens it. I'm talking about jayati, conquers something else. Jayate is victorious without specifying that you're actually conquering something or someone else. Dukkam, we all know as suffering. That is actually from the prefix du. Is cognate with the the Greek dis, meaning bad or wrong. Dysphoria, dyslexia, dystopia, meaning something bad or wrong about it. And the ka means space or place. So dukkha, in a bad place. There is an alternative explanation that it's from dushta, bad standing. I wouldn't have expected dushta or dutta to become dukkha. I mean, it might have done, it's possible. We can just hold it in our mind as an alternative explanation. So bhash, that we've just had, middle, or atmanepada, bhashate. Man, a very common root, man, to think. It's a class 4 verb, which means that it adds a ya, and it's an atmanepada. So that's why it becomes man yate. Manyate, he thinks, which we see in Pali, for the Pali students among you, as manyati. This is another example of how the atmanepada has been essentially lost in Pali. In the later literature and in poetry, you can see forms like manyate, but again, that's more recherche, it's more deliberately educated, even slightly Sanskritized under the later, more Sanskritic influence that came into Pali writing as the centuries went by in India. You would tend not to see this Atmanepada form in the suttas, in the oldest form of Pali. Manyate. By the way, remember, when you get an n and a y in Sanskrit, that tends to become a double nya in Pali. If you just the word anya, meaning other, anya in Sanskrit, which becomes anya in Pali. Lab. Labhate. Again, that's another one that can be parasmaipada as well. You have labhati or labhate. And it sometimes, not always, again has this slight dichotomy of meaning. Labhati, to get it for somebody else. Labhate, just to get it for yourself. Sukham, happiness, opposite of dukkha. Dukkha, sukha, the du and the su have the opposite meanings. So dukkha, sukha, a good space. Or possibly from sushta, well standing. Then I tend to think not, but I could be wrong. And sev, sevate. Next page. Sev, sevate. Translators to serve. It's more than to serve. Yeah, okay, to serve. It's more to attend upon or indulge in or make a habit of doing something. For example, the Buddha said, and sorry, this is going to Pali, but the same principle applies. Dveme anta, dveme bhikkhave anta nasevitabba. Dveme anta, these two extremes are not to be indulged in, are not to be practiced. Don't go in for these two extremes. Or nasevitavya, not to be saved, using the Sanskrit word save, not to be indulged in. So to attach yourself to something, as in a teacher or a particular doctrine. And it is said that the fruit of an evil act comes back to, it comes back to you. Sevate, but prati sevate. Prati, the idea of reciprocity or action and reaction. You do an evil act, and it prati sevate. It sevate attends upon you, but by way of reaction to what you've done. Prati sevate. So that concludes the grammar and vocabulary section of lesson 9, and we'll then move on to the exercises, starting at page 114 in the next video.